My name is Tom Perera, and I am a retired professor of neuroscience, which means that I was studying the coding activities of the brain, how the brain encodes and decodes information. About 40 years ago, I became fascinated with the German Enigma machine, and I started collecting them, and I've been doing that ever since. I collect them, I research them, I restore them, and I sell them. So I'm the only person in the entire world who sells Enigma machines. Very, very strange occupation, you have to admit, one out of the entire world. So let me go on into the discussion of the Enigma. I'm going to start out with history, talk a little bit about the machine, and hopefully answer any question that you have at the end. The Enigma machine was invented by a German named Arthur Scherbius, and he patented the first Enigma in 1918. It was a horrible machine. It failed to sell because, as you see on the left, it was very, very big, very, very heavy, and incredibly expensive. He thought he would sell it to companies for their own internal security, and as far as we can tell, he did not sell a single one. Finally, he learned his lesson, and as you see on the right, he invented a smaller version of the big machine on the left, which he started making in 1922. And this machine is known as the Enigma machine that the Germans used throughout the war. And the machine remained essentially unmodified, exactly the way he invented it back in 1922. And that may be one of the problems, that the Germans never revised this machine. They simply used it as he invented it. Let's start out talking about world history, go back to the very end of World War I, and look at the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in 1919. And the Treaty of Versailles mandated that there be no German army, no German air force, and no German navy, essentially putting the armed forces of the German military out of business. It also split Germany into two parts, with Poland in the middle. And as you can imagine, the Germans were not very happy about that. One German in particular was very unhappy about that. And so he screamed and he yelled, and he pretty much ignored the Treaty of Versailles, but he had to be a little careful about doing that. He had to hide what he was doing. And he used the Enigma machine to hide all of the illegal buildup of military activity leading into World War II. Here you see some pictures of Enigma machines being used to hide what was going on. He also used the Enigma to modify the letters that came out of his transmissions. And the way the Enigma machine works is to take a word, like the word enigma, and to change every letter in the word into another letter. And so the enigma word becomes, after it is enciphered by an enigma machine, the ciphertext XPTQFK. Nobody in their wildest imagination could imagine that XPTQFK stood for enigma. And the only way to reconstruct or decipher XPTQFK into the word enigma was to use another enigma machine. So the enigma machine is capable of enciphering information, words, into absolutely indistinguishable groups of letters, and then taking those indistinguishable groups of letters and deciphering them back into the original word. Hitler and the German military did this in various ways. They hid their buildup of the German army, not only with the Enigma, but by training their soldiers in local hunting clubs. So it looked like they were just going out hunting rather than preparing for war. They changed their German Air Force pilots into glider pilots and trained them in local gliding clubs. And they took the sailors who would eventually become the German Navy and trained these sailors in sailing clubs. And the U-boats, the submarines especially, received special training, and the crews again were trained in sailing clubs. Another thing that Germany was quietly doing was building up concentration camps. This led to the Holocaust, and nobody knew what these were. They didn't look like military bases. They were very strange. The Allies flew over in airplanes and took pictures of them. And this is the concentration camp called Auschwitz. And from the air, it's very difficult to tell what it is, just a bunch of buildings lined up in a row. So they effectively hid the buildup of concentration camps during the war. The concentration camps were built with a lot of electric fences. This is the entrance to Auschwitz, where the people entering were told that if they worked, they would be free. But in fact, the other was the case. And here are some of the prisoners who were brought into Auschwitz, and many of whom ultimately died. The railroad network that brought prisoners into Auschwitz reached out all over Europe. And you can see all of these lines are railroad lines bringing people into Auschwitz from Italy, from all of the countries throughout Europe. And once they got to Auschwitz, they didn't generally survive. So the railroads were a critical part of the Holocaust and bringing the prisoners into the concentration camps. They were often brought in railroad cars, and the Enigma machine was used by the Germans to hide the railroad schedules, the railroad trips to Auschwitz. So the Enigma was used really to hide everything that was going on that was illegal in Germany. And the major problem was that the Germans were building very, very efficient submarines as part of their navy. And in the end, if you look at the statistics, at the end of the war, Germany had sunk with their submarines 3,000 of the Allied ships, and 15 million tons of material went to the bottom, and 150,000 sailors were killed by the U-boat. So the U-boats were very effective, and they were planning to completely surround Europe and cut it off from the rest of the world and give Hitler ultimately control of Europe. The U-boats are the greatest danger in World War II, was what Churchill said about them. He believed that they were extremely dangerous, and every U-boat, interestingly enough, contained and had on board an Enigma machine. So all of the U-boats had Enigma machines on every single submarine. And if we look a little more closely at what an Enigma machine is, we take one apart and we find that it is really very, very simple mechanism. It's modular. You can take the keyboard separate from the plug board, separate from the light panel, and they become very simple. And amazingly enough, the Enigma machine only contained 80 wires for the entire Enigma machine. And you'll see that those 80 wires went to good use in encoding messages. Let's see how the Enigma machine works. If you were to type in the letter A, which we will call the clear text or the plain text letter that you want to hide, the Enigma machine runs the letter A through a bunch of electrical wires and ultimately lights up a light bulb under the letter H. So the Enigma machine encodes the letter A into the letter H. And it's really no more complicated in its operation than a flashlight, where you push a switch and a battery illuminates a bulb. So basically, the Enigma machine is very much like a flashlight. And if you look at the technical circuit inside an Enigma machine, look at the battery over on the left here, and you'll notice that the battery has a positive and negative terminal. And when you press the A key, which is up at the top here, the contact is made with this battery, and electricity then can flow from the battery into a set of wires on the front of the Enigma that change the letter A that you typed in into the letter O. Then the electric voltage goes into a set of rotors, and each of these rotors in the Enigma is wired differently. So it changes the O to a different letter, different letter, different letter. At the end, it enters a device called a reflector, which sends the electric voltage back out through the rotors in a different place. So another letter is changed, letter is changed, letter is changed as you go all the way to the right. This is called the rotor assembly. And you can see we entered with the letter O and we came out with the letter M. The letter M is then connected to the plug board on the front of the Enigma again. And this changes the M into an H. The H voltage is then carried through a light bulb and it lights up the letter H on the panel of the Enigma. So it's really a very simple system. Now, if we want to decode the letter H back into the letter A, we simply set the Enigma machine back to exactly the same starting position, it's called the day's key, as the initial Enigma, and we type the letter H onto the keyboard, and we read the letter A is illuminated in the light bulb panel. So the same Enigma or a similar Enigma can be used to decode an Enigma message as long as it is set to the same starting key as the original Enigma. Every time you type a letter into the Enigma keyboard, it also, in addition to lighting up a light bulb, changes its internal wiring by rotating the rotors. And so you could type in the letter A over and over and over again and get different light bulbs lighting up because the circuitry inside the Enigma changes with every key press. Now let's look at the components that make up the initial setting of the Enigma. And this is crucially important because if you don't have the Enigma set in exactly the same way for both the encoding and decoding Enigma, you will not be able to correctly decode a message. The rotors, these rotary wheels, have numbers and have different positions along the axle. And there are 60 different possible positions of the rotors along the axle on which they rotate. Each rotor has an internal ring setting, an internal setting that tells it where it's going to rotate the adjacent rotor, 676 of these. The rotor has an initial starting position, and that's the position that you read in the little window at the top of the machine, 17,576 of these, and the wires on the front of the Enigma, the so-called jumper cables, can have possible settings that are 5 times 10 to the 15th power. And if you add all this together, you find that the total possible number of days keys, that is, the way an Enigma could be set on a particular day, is 10 to the 114th power. There are only 10 to the 80th power atoms in the entire observable universe. So it's a very, very big number. Let's look at it differently. Here is a picture of the day's key of an Army Enigma. It is your chance of finding the right day's key for an Enigma is 1 out of 10 to the 114th power. possibilities. That is 10 followed by 114 zeros. So that's a very, very large number. And the chief of the U-boats, Karl Dönitz, knew this full well, and he felt absolutely confident that every message he typed into an Enigma machine and encoded with the Enigma machine would be forever undecipherable except by his Navy, who had the proper day's key to set their Enigma machine. He actually transmitted radio messages to every submarine every day, and he instructed the submarines to send back to him their exact location on the ocean. That is their GPS location, their latitude and longitude. So his submarines were sending back their exact locations throughout the entire war, and he was absolutely confident nobody would be able to read these. In fact, when he died, much long after the war, he still didn't believe that anybody had read his Enigma messages. And again, his U-boats were able to sink 3,000 ships in World War II. So they were very, very effective. But it was critically important to read these Enigma messages. If you saw the silly movie Imitation Game, you saw an actor who was dressed up like Alan Turing, decoding the Enigma machine. Alan Turing did not decode the Enigma machine first. It was done 6 years before Alan Turing had anything to do with it. The only good thing about the movie is that they used one of my Enigma machines in the movie. And so that made me feel good about it, but they would not listen to me when I asked for historical accuracy. They also showed Alan Turing as having built this wonderful big machine to decode Enigma machines, and it indeed was the case that Alan Turing was not the first. The Poles, 3 brilliant Polish mathematicians, were the first people to break the Enigma code, and they did it 6 years before the war started in 1939. So way back in the early 1930s, Polish mathematicians were breaking the Enigma code, reading the Enigma messages. These were done because Poland realized that it was sandwiched between Germany and Germany. They realized that they were going to be overrun, and they wanted to hear about it. So they set up a special group of people, mathematicians, to crack the Enigma code so they would know when Germany was going to invade. Here are the 3 brilliant Polish mathematicians who decoded the Enigma message. The first thing they had to do was to figure out the actual internal wiring of the rotors in the Enigma. And they did that way back in 1932. And then they built the first Enigma decoding machines, the machines that Alan Turing was given credit for in the movie. Here's what an Enigma rotor looks like. It has a very complicated set of wiring inside the Enigma rotor. And the Poles figured out exactly what wire would connect this pin over to that pin over there. Exactly the internal wiring of the Enigma. You had to know that in order to be at all successful in cracking the Enigma code. Once they had that, they built replicas of the Enigma to study and to work on. And finally, they built deciphering machines, which, although not as complex as the one we saw Alan Turing in front of, were the beginning of mechanical decoding devices for the Enigma. And remember that the Poles were doing this 6 years before Poland was invaded by Germany and 6 years before the British had anything to do with the decoding process. Now, in 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the people working in Poland on deciphering the Enigma had to get out in a hurry, and they quickly packed up their machines and got on trains and headed for France. And unfortunately, they had a very hard trip, and they decided they were going to destroy their machines, the decoding machines along the way, and only keep the papers. And so they brought these to France, where the French military under Bertrand was able to reconstruct the techniques for deciphering the Enigma, but at that point, France was in jeopardy of being invaded as well, and eventually the information went over to England, to the British. And the British, when they received this information in 1939, took over code breaking at a special site called Bletchley Park, which is a beautiful old country mansion. And they eventually employed 10,000 different code breakers working on the Enigma machine decoding using the Polish technology. When they decoded an Enigma message, they called that decoded message Ultra. Ultra was the name that they gave for the secret decodes of the Enigma messages. And it turned out that many, many people had written histories of World War II, after World War II, and they didn't know that the Enigma machine had been deciphered by the Allies. In fact, it was first revealed only in 1975. 30 years after the end of the war. So all the historians thought they were writing proper histories of World War II, but they didn't know about the Enigma. And the Enigma was very influential in ending World War II. So we really have to throw out all of the World War II history books that were written before 1975. And as we see down here, Admiral Dönitz, the head of the U-boats, even when he died in the 1980s, I believe, still refused to believe that the Enigma messages had been deciphered. Alan Turing took over the work of the Poles in Bletchley Park and brilliantly built fantastic machines to speed up the decoding. They called these machines the same that the Poles had called them, a bomb. Nobody really knows why they chose that word. Some people think it's because the machine ticked like a time bomb. Some people think it's because the machine reminded them of a Polish dessert called a bomba. So that's one of the mysteries. We don't know where the name came from, but they built these wonderful machines that could decode Enigma messages much, much faster than the Polish were able to. And this is the inside of a British bomba decoding machine. As you can see, it's very, very complex. And it became even more complex later in the war when the Germans brought in some new enciphering machines built more complexly than the Enigma. They still used the Enigma, but they added complexity, added some other machine, and to decode those, the machine called Colossus was built at Bletchley Park. Many people consider this to be the very first of the digital computers. So Colossus was built to decipher the messages. Turing was also helped by numbers of factors. One, the capture of code books from German U-boats. If you were able to capture a U-boat and get the code book, you would have the day's key settings for all of the Enigmas in the entire German Navy for whatever days the code book was good for. Code books were good for 30 days. So if you got one near the beginning of the month, you would have the key to decipher all of the messages for every U-boat for the entire month. There were also repeatable, predictable words in messages. The German word for one, eins, was very often found in messages, and the decoding machines could hunt for those messages. And there were a lot of other discoveries and techniques. There's a picture of U-505 being boarded, and the Enigma machine and the papers were removed, and it was towed home by the British and ultimately ended up in the United States in Chicago, along with its Enigma machine. You can visit it there. The problem with all of this was that since the Allies knew where every single U-boat was exactly on the ocean, they couldn't let the Germans know that. And sometimes they had to hide that information from the Germans by pretending they didn't have it and letting the Germans attack convoys and attack and bomb various cities. So that was a sacrifice that had to be made, because if the Germans had found out that the Allies were cracking the Enigma code, the Germans would have immediately changed their technology, and the Allies would not have known where all the Enigmas were. Another factor in the failure of the Enigma was the fact that the Germans chose their prisoners of war to make Enigma machines and a lot of other things. Here are some prisoners of war building BMW engines for German aircraft. Here are prisoners of war building high-tech rockets for use, the V2 and V1 rockets. And here are German prisoners, we think, building Enigma machines. Not totally sure about this picture, but the point is that if you take prisoners who hate you and you say, build a machine for me, the prisoners are going to try and sabotage the machine. And in the many, many, many Enigmas that I have taken apart, we have found, my son and I have found, incidents of sabotage within the Enigma. Now, if you're going to sabotage an Enigma, you had to do it very secretly and subtly. You didn't want to do it in any overt way, because then they would see that you were sabotaging the Enigma in the factory and they would kill you. So they had to do this in a subtle way. One of the techniques that we found was that the prisoners of war would, quote, accidentally leave one of the plugs from the front of an Enigma down under the keyboard of an Enigma, as though it had just fallen there during the manufacturing process. Whenever you press one of the keys on the keyboard of an Enigma, it comes down and pushes this horizontal bar down at the bottom downward. And it has to go all the way down in order to move the rotors properly and register the letter you've just typed in. If there's something in the way, like this plug, you will stop the bar from coming down, make the Enigma machine stop working, and sabotage the activity of the Enigma machines. Here's another clever one. They found some fish hooks and must have inserted the fish hooks, just dropped the fish hooks into the back of the plug board of an Enigma. You can see this black thing is a fish hook outlined by the green arrows. And what happens is the fish hook, eventually, the barb at the end is very sharp, and it works its way through the enamel insulation on the metal and on the wires, and short circuits or changes the circuit in the Enigma machine, makes it so it doesn't work. So that was a second sabotage technique. Another one that was, we found some screws that were used to hold wires into the plugs on the front of the Enigma. The screws were too long and they didn't crimp down the wire tight enough. So the wire was loose and it would eventually loosen up and stop working reliably. So there were three techniques that were used to sabotage the Enigmas. So if we sum this all up, we see that World War II, there were 784 out of the 1,152 U-boats were sunk. And many of those, most of those, because we knew where they were. The 40,000 U-boat crew embarked on these submarines, 28,000 of them were killed. So if we go down and look at the effect of Enigma deciphering, we see that the deciphering of the Enigma shortened the war by what most historians believe to be about 2 years, saved thousands and thousands of lives of soldiers who would have died if the war had gone on for 2 more years, and prevented Hitler from completing the work on the atomic bomb. In addition, the Enigma machine revealed to the world what was going on during the Holocaust. And here is an intercepted Enigma message up at the top that shows enigma-coded letters that make no sense at all. If you look at them, they're just rows of 5-letter groups. And in those letters, a message was contained, and down below is the decoding of the message. And it shows that deaths in German prison camps, if you look at Auschwitz, for instance, 6,829 men, 1,525 women died in Auschwitz in 1 month. In Niedersachsen, 21, in Flossenburg, 88, in Buchenwald, 74, and so on. And down at the very bottom, the Germans decided that as of the January 9th of 1942, natural deaths among prisoners in concentration camps were to be reported only in writing and not sent by radio messages. So deciphering messages like this let the world know what was going on during the Holocaust. At the end of the war, as Hitler was committed suicide and the Germans realized that they had to surrender, they were given the instructions to destroy every single Enigma. And specifically, they were told they had to blow up the Enigmas with explosives, shoot them with guns, or throw them into lakes. And here we see a reenactment, actually, of Germans destroying an Enigma machine. They would have kicked it like this and then banged on it with a rifle to totally destroy it. Of the 40,000 Enigma machines that were made during World War II, there are only 397 surviving Enigmas. We keep track of the number of surviving Enigmas in my enigma-museum.com website. Most of them ended up looking like this: destroyed relics. You can see where it's been kicked in and thrown in the water, typical of the destruction of the Enigma. At the end of the war, strangely enough, Churchill also ordered the destruction of every single Enigma that was found by the British and Allied troops, and he ordered the destruction of the British bombs that deciphered the Enigma and the plans and papers for the bombs. Why would he have done that? And the answer didn't turn up until a year ago, when we found an Enigma machine with a Hebrew keyboard. An Enigma machine with a Hebrew keyboard. It didn't make any sense to us at that point either. But a great deal of research into the Israeli archives turned up the fact that Churchill had quietly given 40 Enigma machines to Israel and told them, go ahead and use these wonderful German machines for your internal security. All of your military messages will be very, very secure. And the Israelis were told that. Churchill did this with a number of other countries, South American countries, Norwegian, Spain, and so on, said, go ahead and use the Enigma. What he didn't tell them was that he had kept a few of the British bombs from being destroyed, and that he would be able to then read any and all of the messages that were sent and received with the Enigma machines that he provided to Israel and other countries. Israel, unfortunately for Churchill, didn't work out, because there was an Israeli who had worked at Bletchley Park, and although he couldn't reveal the fact that the Enigma code had been decoded, he did suggest to Ben-Gurion, you know the story of the Trojan horse? The Enigma might be a little like that. And Ben-Gurion got the message and didn't use the Enigma machine for the Israelis. But that's the reason that Churchill made it seem as though he had destroyed all of the Enigmas and then secretly kept some. Enigmas are very hard to find these days. There are a few that you can find buried in battlefields, and most of them were blown up as the Germans ordered with hand grenades. Here's an Enigma machine that was beaten on and blown up. Here are pieces of Enigma machines that have been dug up from battlefields, and they're very, very hard to find. Some of them are buried in mud and require considerable hunting. Here's a typical story. General Hasso-Eckert von Manteuffel was surrounded by the 3rd Panzer Division, American Panzer Division in Sulzdorf, Germany. And he was given the choice of surrendering, and he surrendered to British General Montgomery in 1945. And when he did that, Before he surrendered, he secretly buried his Enigma machine in the ground and destroyed it. And a number of people have been hunting for this, and they were finally able to find the spot where the general had buried his Enigma machine. You can see it quite far down in this hole. And you're starting to see this little rusty piece of metal down at the bottom. And if you dig a little bit harder, a little further, you see the plug board on the front of an Enigma machine. And then you bring out and you find that this is Van Teufel's Enigma machine. After you clean all the dirt off it, you look at the machine, you can see how it was destroyed and recover this very, very, very historic machine. Clearly it belongs in a museum and it has great historic value. The Germans also threw Enigma machines into lakes. And this is a perfectly lovely bucolic lake in northern Germany. And if you look at the lake, unfortunately, the water is very, very muddy. And that means you can't see things in the lake water. And so what you do is you take a underwater metal locator like this, and you use this metal locator to hunt for metal objects at the bottom of the lake. You put on scuba gear, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, scuba gear, and you go diving in the lake, and you hold this metal locator, and you, when it makes a sound in your earphones, you reach down and you pull up whatever metal object you find at the bottom of the lake. And here are some of the objects that were found at the bottom of the lake with a metal locator. And on the left, we see an experimental torpedo device. On the right, we see German field radios, but in the middle here is an Enigma machine. It doesn't look like an Enigma machine, looks like a rusty old hunk of metal, but it is a very historic Enigma machine. And if you look at it more closely, you begin to see the outline of the Enigma, and you wonder, you do a post-mortem, you try and figure out how the Enigma machine was destroyed. And we looked at this Enigma machine. Clearly, one of the ways that the Germans destroyed their Enigmas were to kick in the front of the Enigma. And that was often done with boots. And that's been done here. You can see where the front has been kicked in, the plug board. But then there's this bent part of the light bulb panel. And the bend looks very familiar. And if you go and you get an exact German Mauser rifle, and you take that rifle and you fit it into the bend, you find that the bend in the light bulb panel exactly matches the butt end of the rifle. And so we now know that the Germans used rifle butts in order to crush their Enigmas and to break them. Another place to look for Enigma machines is, of course, sunken submarines. And there were 4 sunken submarines, 5 actually, off the United States coast. Divers looking for these submarines. This is U-352 before it was sunk, and here is U-352 on the bottom of the ocean off the coast, the east coast of America. And if you swim inside the openings of a U-boat, the hatch of the U-boat, and that's very, very dangerous to do because you just barely fit into a U-boat opening with scuba tanks on the back. And this is a daredevil diver named Richie Kohler. He's done a lot of wreck diving, and he was bound and determined that he was going to find the Enigma machine inside the U-352. And sure enough, he was able to get into the radio room and recover the Enigma machine from the radio room. And this is the way it looks. Some of you may have seen that recently divers have found some Enigma machines that were thrown into the Baltic Sea, and they were recovered. And right now, several museums in Germany are trying to restore those Enigma machines that were found in that way. Every once in a while, you find somebody who has kept an Enigma machine quietly to himself. And this man's father had an Enigma machine. He heard about the destroy on site order at the end of the war. And he said, well, I'm just going to take one of these Enigma machines home with me and I'll hide it in the basement and nobody will know and I'll keep it. And this guy decided that he was going to bring it out. And he knew that I collected Enigma machines. And you can see him sitting inside his German Me-109 fighter plane. And his object was to be able to buy an engine for his fighter plane and to actually fly his fighter plane. And in order to get that engine, he needed money. And so he offered me his Enigma machine in trade for enough money to buy the engine for his airplane. And we made a good deal. He was happy, I was happy. And we ended up with his Enigma machine. He ended up with an engine for his airplane. I did a great deal of hunting all over Germany for Enigma machines. And every once in a while, I would find one in a basement typically or an attic. But when I met this man, I was absolutely amazed because he had 1, 2, 3 Enigma machines hidden under a desk in his shop. And you can see him pulling out these Enigma machines and selling them to me. And I bought these machines, and this machine that he has his hands on is the actual same machine that you saw in the Imitation Game movie. We restored it and made it work again, took it all apart, restored it, made it work. And that's the way we found that Enigma machine. So there are a bunch of people in the world, crazy people like myself. I'm the one under the red arrow here, but all of these people are out there studying enigmas. Not many of them have them because there aren't many of them there, but these are enigma historians, and they do this work and try to clarify more and more of our understanding of what happened with the enigma during the war. You may wonder about what the Americans and the British used as their code machines. This is the American World War II M209 cipher machine that was used very widely throughout the war. It's a relatively complex but somewhat simple machine in that it doesn't have any electrical properties at all. It is purely mechanical. You spin a dial over on the left here to select a letter. You turn a handle over on the right to make the machine work. And then the machine prints out on a paper tape the letter, the coded version, the cipher text version of the letter that you have set into the machine. This is a much more complex American cipher machine called the SIG-ABA, and it was kept secret throughout the war. As far as we know, nobody ever cracked the SIG-ABA machine, and that was the main machine that was used by the Americans when they needed to keep their information super secret. This is the British World War II Type X cipher machine, a little bit like an Enigma machine, a little bit like a SIG-ABA. It was a very secure machine that the British invented in order to encode their messages. You would type a message on the keyboard, and the Type X would actually type out the message on a piece of paper tape. So somewhat similar to some of the others. And this is the Russian Cold War cipher machine called Fialka, which is the code name that the Russians gave it. And it is a very complex machine. If you open it up, you can see that whereas the Enigma machine had 3 rotors, or late in the war, Dönitz added another rotor to his Enigma to make a 4-rotor Enigma machine. This machine has 10 rotors. And rather than having all the rotors rotate in the same direction, the Fialka has rotors that rotate in opposite directions. So if this rotor rotated, one rotor rotated to the back, the next one on either side would be rotating to the front. So it's a very, very complex and interesting machine that is used by the Russians, was used right until fairly recently by the Russians as their main cipher machine. For the United States, nowadays, they're no longer using machines like this. They have a machine, a walkie-talkie, a mobile radio, which contains the equivalent of an Enigma machine inside it. And this is a Harris made by the Harris Company, RF310M, and it actually has a little computer inside it that acts like an Enigma machine. And you'll see these devices being used to guard the president, to all throughout some of the war zones and so on. So that's about what I have to say about the Enigma. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I hope you've found that interesting. And let me know if I've missed anything or if you have any questions.